the queen who was forbidden to touch her own son. In our last story, we watched as Hugh Despenser, the man who bled England dry, was dragged through the streets, disemboweled while still alive, and turned into a warning nailed to a wall. Justice, they said, retribution, the end of tyranny. But what no one tells you is this. Before Despenser died, he first destroyed something far more fragile than a kingdom. He destroyed a woman's place as a mother, and that woman was the queen. The guard avoided her eyes. One hand rested on the door, the other on his sword, not as threat, but as decree. Behind that door, just 10 steps away, was her son, her child, her heir, her only blood in a foreign land. Isabella's voice cracked as it escaped her throat. I gave birth to the boy. I nursed him when the king could barely remember his name. The guard hesitated. Then, coldly, by order of the king and Lord Despenser, no exceptions. The words didn't hit her like a sword. No, they slithered in like poison, not fast, not fatal, but deep and permanent. The door closed, slowly, deliberately, and she watched it with dry eyes because queens were not allowed to cry. Not here, not anymore. They barred me from my son, but in doing so, they unlocked something far more dangerous. To the court, she was still Queen Isabella, wife of Edward II, daughter of King Philip IV of France. Regal, elegant, contained, but within her chest, a storm had been gathering for years, and today it cracked. She had tolerated much. The whispers that her husband preferred his favorites. The sting of being reduced to a ceremonial ornament while Hugh Despenser, the king's lover and leech, rewrote the rules of court. She had swallowed betrayals like bitter wine, without complaint, without scandal. But this was a different kind of cruelty. They hadn't struck her crown. They struck her womb, her motherhood, her reason for enduring all of it. From the day Despenser rose, Isabella's world had grown colder. Her chambers were emptied of loyal attendants. Her letters went unanswered. Her voice in council was met with the kind of silence that doesn't ignore you, but erases you. Still, she endured. Because she believed, foolishly, that if she remained still, she would remain queen. That dignity would outlast ambition. But now, standing in that stone corridor, with the chill of November in her bones and the face of her son locked behind a royal order, something inside her ruptured. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel afraid. She felt hatred. Hatred for Hugh Despenser and his serpentine rise. Hatred for Edward, who allowed it. Hatred for a court that had clipped her wings and called it protocol. She turned on her heel, the train of her gown scraping the floor like a blade. The guards watched her go, unmoved. What none of them saw was the way her hands clenched, tight, white-knuckled, not with grief, but with fury. Queen Isabella had been dismissed, but she was not finished, and soon neither would they be. That day, they barred her from seeing her son, but what they truly did was hand her something far more dangerous than affection: silence. Silence sharp enough to cut, silence long enough to shape steel. Silence cruel enough to force a queen to become something else, not yet a rebel, but no longer obedient. She would not strike back, not yet. Instead, she would sit beside her husband in council, say nothing, smile slightly, and watch the men who had stolen her power begin to rot from the inside. Because before a fire rises, it learns to smolder. And so began the quiet reign of endurance, where pride wore a mask and grief learned how to wait. In the next chapter, the dignity she refused to surrender and the silent war she fought beneath velvet sleeves. They expected her to scream. She chose to curtsy. She returned to court the very next morning, not flanked by soldiers, not wailing in grief. She walked into the royal hall in lavender silk, the color of bruises, not fresh but still aching. The men who had ordered her barred from her own child looked up, stiff with unease. But Isabella said nothing. She merely inclined her head. A curtsy, polite, controlled, devastating. From that day forward, she reclaimed her place not with force, but with presence. Her chair in council, once removed, was returned. Her name, once whispered, was again spoken aloud, if only in awkward tones, but they didn't understand. She didn't want their favor anymore. She wanted their discomfort. She played the long game. Each public ceremony she attended, each procession she marched in beside the king and Despenser, was a silent war. They stood on her right, but she stood inside their nerves. At a harvest feast, she raised a toast to the enduring strength of royal families, and her eyes never left Despenser. At a royal baptism, she touched the newborn's head and murmured, "May you never be torn from your mother." And once, in the gardens, she caught Edward's gaze across a marble courtyard. Her son hesitated and then looked away. She smiled gently then, not with warmth, but with a promise. I can wait longer than they can pretend. Behind closed doors, she suffered. She bit the inside of her cheek during meals, bled through her gloves during council. She burned her own letters rather than let them be intercepted. And at night, she prayed, not for deliverance, but for clarity. If I cannot be queen to this kingdom, then I will be queen to its memory. The walls of power were tightening. But Isabella was not pacing. She was counting stones, marking exits, learning names. And the moment they tried to erase her completely, she would make sure her absence rang louder than their voices ever could. Next, when silence is no longer enough, and history begins to push her out for good. Some queens fall with fire. Others are simply written out of the story. It didn't happen with a trial. No guards dragged her from court. No one shouted her name in disgrace. They just stopped calling it. One morning, the list of royal events was posted. Her name was absent. At the treasury, her allowance was under review. And then the final blow. A polite letter sealed with wax, informing her that her summer residence had been reassigned to Lord Despenser's cousin. No explanation, no confrontation, just quiet, systematic exile. They called it reallocation. She called it what it was, a cleansing. Her chambers were reduced from a gilded suite to a cold stone wing overlooking the outer walls. The tapestries were taken, the mirrors removed. Even the servants who remained stopped looking her in the eye. Once, she passed by the royal library and noticed something strange. The official lineage scroll, the massive one used in state ceremonies, had a tear near her name. She reached out to touch it. Someone had tried to mend it. Badly. Isabella didn't rage. She didn't protest. That would have given them something to justify. Instead, she began to disappear with dignity. Every time they removed a title, she stitched her own gown. Every time they took a portrait down, she burned another letter in the hearth. But even in retreat, she kept watching. Power does not vanish, it moves, and I will follow it, even if I must crawl. One night, a banquet was held. She wasn't invited, but she stood at her window, high above the hall, and watched the lights flicker in the stained glass. She could almost hear the laughter, the music, the toasts made by men who thought they had won. She sat in silence, and in her lap she held a book, not a Bible, not poetry, but a copy of the English-French trade treaties. Because while they celebrated her absence, she was memorizing the lines that held the kingdom together. She was no longer part of the story, but history has cracks, and through them something stirs. Next, when exile is not quiet, but a prison made of eyes and walls that breathe distrust, the Queen survives, but only as a shadow. They didn't need to kill her. They just needed her to disappear while still breathing. They gave her a tower, not a prison, not quite. It had a hearth, a desk, a narrow bed, and a single window, too small to step through, too high to see out. No one called it exile. No one used the word punishment. But everyone understood what this was. It was containment. She still wore silk, though it hung loose on her frame. She still braided her hair, though no one was there to see it. And every morning she still bowed before the cross, though her hands trembled with doubt. Once she tried to write a letter to her son, but halfway through her pen stopped. What was she supposed to say? I miss you. Do you remember me? Or worse, do you still believe I'm dangerous? She burned the letter before the ink had dried. There were servants, of course, but not hers. They watched her, smiled too politely, whispered too quietly. One brought her food with gloves on. Another apologized when delivering nothing at all. I'm sorry, Your Grace. There were no fresh apples today. She hadn't asked. The walls weren't thick. She heard things, her name, rumors, pity. Someone said she had taken ill. Another that she had lost her mind. Once she heard a young page whisper, didn't she used to be important? But she didn't scream, she didn't beg, she didn't die. She moved like someone underwater, slow, measured, watching the surface from below. She paced the same 7 steps from desk to window until the stone floor wore a faint groove. She read treaties, redrafted borders, and late at night she stitched something by candlelight. A small piece of embroidery, the French fleur-de-lis entwined with the English lion. Not for politics, not for peace, just to remember who she was. And then something changed. Not in the court, not in the world, but in her. One morning, she looked into the tarnished mirror above her desk, and for the first time, she didn't see grief. She saw strategy. Next, the first letter that would never be signed with her name, but would start a war. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't a sword. It was a letter with no signature that changed everything. The candle flickered once, then held. Her hand hovered above the parchment, and for the first time in months, it didn't tremble. She dipped the quill, exhaled slowly, and began to write. To those who remember what justice once looked like. No crest, no name, but every word on the page carried the weight of a crown. That letter reached France in 6 days. Another made it to Hainaut. Another, coded, hidden between lines of poetry, found its way into the hands of Roger Mortimer. Yes, him, the exiled traitor. The man Despenser had thrown into the tower, then into oblivion. And yet, when he read her words, he didn't hesitate, because only a woman who had nothing left to lose could write with such precision. They met in secret, far from England, far from memory. There was no affection in their first exchange, no warmth, just one sentence from Isabella. "You want your revenge? I want my son back. Help me burn the rest." Mortimer blinked, and then he nodded. Months passed, troops were promised, gold pledged, ships prepared. But she made one more move, one no one expected. She arranged the betrothal of Edward, her son, to Philippa of Hainaut. It wasn't love, it wasn't ideal, it was leverage. If I cannot protect him as a mother, I will protect him as a strategist. With that marriage came soldiers, with soldiers ships, with ships hope, real steel-lined, blade-sharp hope. She stood on the edge of a French port, wind in her hair, cloak heavy with salt and resolve. Behind her, betrayal, before her, war. And as the sails rose above the horizon, she whispered, "This time I will not knock, I will break the door." She left England as a ghost. She would return as a storm. Next, the landing, the uprising, and the queen who came back not to beg, but to conquer. She crossed the sea not as a queen, but as a question the kingdom could no longer avoid. They expected pirates, mercenaries, rebels. Instead, what came ashore was a queen, dressed not in silk, but in steel-grey wool. No royal banners, no trumpet call, just Isabella, flanked by soldiers, fueled by betrayal, led by silence sharper than any war cry. She landed on English soil in the chill of autumn. The moment her boots touched ground, nobles began to defect. Not out of loyalty, not out of fear, but because they'd seen enough of Despenser's cruelty, and now they saw something better. A woman who had bled for her dignity and come back to reclaim it. Her return wasn't met with armies. It was met with opened gates. Town after town surrendered. No siege, no fire, just doors left wide. She marched not like a monarch, but like a reckoning. Villagers knelt. Lords rode out to pledge. And in the capital, Despenser panicked. He ran, dragging the king with him, like a drowning man clinging to driftwood. But driftwood doesn't float forever. When they caught him, Despenser didn't beg. He simply looked to Isabella and whispered, "You wouldn't not like this." She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because now the people screamed in her place. The trial was swift. The sentence, louder than any proclamation she'd ever been allowed to make. As he was dragged to the scaffold, Isabella stood still. One gloved hand holding her cloak, the other pressed over her heart, not in grief, in memory. And then it was done. Despenser's blood soaked the wood, his body was scattered, and the kingdom exhaled. But Isabella, she didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply turned to the throne and found it just as empty as she had left it. Justice is not victory, not yet. The tyrant was dead. The queen had returned, but power has a strange memory. Next, the backlash, the shadows of old loyalties, and the crown that weighs different when worn alone. The kingdom she saved began to ask if she had gone too far. The tyrant was gone, the people cheered, the court bowed, but Isabella stood alone. There was no crown waiting for her, no title carved in gold. Only a throne that looked back like an accusation. In the weeks after Despenser's death, she ruled as regent. Edward II was imprisoned. Edward III, her son, was still just a boy. And so, for the first time, Isabella held real power. Not borrowed, not symbolic. Power with teeth, but power remembers. And England does not love women who win too well. At first, the whispers returned like old ghosts. She speaks more than the council allows. She favors Mortimer too openly. She's starting to resemble the man she just destroyed. And Mortimer, once a partner in vengeance, began to grow hungry in his own right. He demanded new titles, made decisions without her, built a court within a court filled with men who bowed only to him. One night, at a banquet meant to honor the new order, Isabella arrived late and found her seat moved to the side of the hall. Not gone, just shifted. It felt like the start of erasure all over again. Her son watched everything. Edward III, no longer a boy, not yet a man, sat at her left hand in silence. She tried to speak to him that night. Tried to explain, "I did this for you." He didn't look up. "Then why does it feel like you did it without me?" That silence cut deeper than Despenser ever could. And so came the reckoning. A year later, without warning, Mortimer was arrested. The charges: corruption, treason, overreach. The sentence: death. Isabella begged for his life, not because she loved him, but because his death would erase her all over again. But Edward III, now king in his own right, refused to listen. Mortimer was hanged, and Isabella was spared, but not restored. She was moved to a small estate. No trial, no exile, just absence. This time quieter, more polite. But she understood. I was useful once, then dangerous, and now inconvenient. History had judged her, and yet something remained. Because even when they erased her name from court, they couldn't erase the memory of what she had done, or who she had been before the silence. Next, a queen in retreat, a mother reclaimed, and the quiet power of a woman history tried to forget. She never returned to court, but somehow she never really left. Years passed, no trials, no poems, no statues, but in a quiet estate far from London, Isabella lived. Not as a queen, not as a prisoner, but as a woman who had already seen the inside of history's darkest rooms and walked out. She spent her days among books, not courtiers. She read treaties, translated Latin, walked under grey skies and counted the petals falling from trees. Some say she grew mad. Others say she finally found peace. One autumn morning, she asked for a cloak she hadn't worn in decades. Inside its lining, stitched in secret, was a piece of cloth she'd embroidered long ago. The fleur-de-lis of France and the lion of England, still bound together. She placed it on her writing desk, lit a candle, and watched the wax melt, as if history itself was softening. When she died, there was no royal procession, but her son, Edward III, sent word that she was to be buried with the crown she had once worn. Not on her head, on her chest, close to the heart that had once fought a kingdom alone. They tried to forget her, but you don't forget the queen who overthrew a king. You don't forget the mother who came back for her son with an army behind her. And maybe, you don't forget the woman who, in the end, chose silence again. Not out of fear, but because she had already said everything that mattered. "If they ever write about me," she once whispered, "let it be said that I waited. And when the time came, I was not kind." So what do we do with women like her? The ones who refuse to break, but also refuse to smile for the story. Do we honor them? Do we fear them? Or do we quietly thank them because they survived the very world that tried to erase them? I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think Isabella was a hero, a villain, or something more dangerous, someone uncomfortably human? Backhand index pointing right, leave a comment below. And if you believe stories like hers still matter, subscribe, and let's keep digging up the truths they try to bury.